Greetings viewers, EricTheCarGuy here, back again with another repair video for you, here with the 1979 Ford Fairmont. Well, it's a Fox body, so it applies to many different vehicles, but today's procedure also applies to a wide variety of vehicles as far as brake hose replacement. You may recall during the video that I did where I did an inspection on this car, one of the things we found were cracked brake hoses. Well, one of the things that I'm hoping to do with this is take it to the track, and cracked brake hoses aren't going to pass tech, so we got to take care of those things before we go out there. Even though we'll probably replace them with an upgraded performance version in the future, we still have to conform to the rules of the track now, don't we? Here's our tools that we're going to use for the job. I have a couple of hammers here. You really just need one, but I've got this one in case I need to use it on some of my tools. I don't want to damage them. But hammers, just a regular flathead screwdriver, a pair of just regular pliers. I have an 11mm line wrench or flare wrench. I can't stress enough how important this tool is for getting brake lines loose, because if you don't use a tool like this and you're just using an open-ended wrench like this, there's a high probability that you could round the fastener off, and if you do that, you'll be putting a brake line on it. So to avoid that, line wrench. 16mm open box end. Also, I have a 9mm here in both socket and wrench form. The bleeder valves are 9mm and they've gotten a bit old. Here we have our new brake hose that we're going to be replacing. A little bit of penetrating oil, some brake fluid to top it off when we're done, and of course my brake bleeding tool that you've seen me use in the past, as well as a rag. It's not going to take that long to do this, but we want to work quickly, and one of the reasons is because as you've seen me work in other videos where I'm doing hydraulic work on brakes, you've seen me crimp off the rubber brake line. Well, since we're replacing the rubber brake line, we don't have that option. So in order to avoid bleeding out the entire master cylinder, we're going to first top up the master cylinder and make sure it's as filled as much as it possibly can be. But in addition to that, we're also going to try to work quickly so that we don't have to worry about losing a bunch of brake fluid while we do the job. So why don't we start with that? Let's start with checking the master cylinder, making sure it's filled up, and then we'll come back down here and get into things. So I lied. Before we go up there, I'm going to do just a preemptive strike here and add a little penetrating oil to this brake line before we break it loose. That way, when we go to break it loose, it should happen easily. Okay, I'll just open up the master here. It looks like we're fairly full right now. I just push that little top in. The larger reservoirs for the front brakes, the smaller reservoir for the rear brakes. So far, and it looks like we're all right. So I'm just going to leave that as is. I'll leave the top off for now, but we'll actually, you know what? I'm going to put the top back on because it'll work sort of like a plug and actually make it sort of leak less. But at least now we know we've got a good amount of brake fluid in here to start with, which is a good thing because remember, we don't want to run it dry. Okay, I'm going to start, like I said, for the sake of trying to keep this as efficient as possible. I'm going to start with the most difficult part first, which I'm going to loosen this brake line right here that goes in. Remember, line wrench. This, I can't stress enough how much of a difference using one of these wrenches makes. And now that it's broken loose, I'm going to leave it just a little bit loose like that. I'm going to sort of tighten it up. That way I'm going to be able to get the clip out, and then I'll just spin it off of the clip. If you try to break it loose after you've removed the clip that holds the hose in here, you won't be as successful because it'll probably all spin. So it's best to break it loose first. Now I'm going to jump down to the lower part of the hose. And next, I'm going to knock loose the line that goes into the caliper. This is the 16mm wrench here. Same thing, I'm just going to knock it loose and just sort of bring it back just a little bit. Like I said, this will all help as far as getting everything back together more quickly when we're all done. I also forgot to mention that I have my drain pan underneath here because brake fluid's going to be dripping out. In order to prevent it going all over my floor, I have this pan here and ready. Okay, we're first going to remove this clip. Now you can do this a couple of different ways. I may be able to come in here with this pair of pliers, but I don't quite have enough room yet, so I'm going to try with a screwdriver. Oops. There we go. Now that we got it moving, grab it with our pliers. bunch of undercoating here that's coming off. There we go. And now that I've got it broken loose, I can still leave it pushed down into its mount here, but I'll be able to unscrew the brake line. And this is where you want to make sure that your pan is ready to catch any fluid that might come out. Okay, now we're going to quickly move to the other end. And just pull that up out of there. And before I get this all the way out, I'm going to take my rag and just sort of dust it off around the outside, because there's a little bit of dirt up here that I don't want to get down into the caliper itself. The old line down. And you want to start with the same end, because you're going to have to be twisting it when you insert it into the caliper. So get it all the way down until it's bottomed out, like that, and then you can bring... This hole is not round. In fact, you'll see on the end of this, there's some slots that it can go into, like a nut. You want to get it down in there so that it seats. And as you do, bring the brake hose or line up in here. And get this started before you put the clip in. There we go. And now that that's relatively seated, we're kind of safe at this point. The clip needs to go in this way. This tab faces down. And this is the part where we'll need our hammer, tap it back into place. You can just tighten it up. Other end. Done. New brake hose installed. Okay, I'm gonna jump over and do the other side, and I'll come back so I can bleed both sides. Okay, here on the other side, it's virtually the same process. I'm gonna just run through it. Since I showed you the details on the other side, I'm just gonna do it as if I'm working on my own this time. Sort of run through the process. First, the flare wrench. Next, I'll take the line out. Sometimes when you use a rag, it helps you get a better grip on a fastener. Might get a couple extra turns out of it that way. Sort of like if you use like one of those jar opener things. Get rid of the dirt. do not want to cross thread any of this stuff. You'd be buying expensive parts if you do. No thread tape or anything on this. Just install it as is. Once again, I want to make sure my hose is in a good position to where it's not going to be in a bind as the suspension moves up and down. And there we go. And I'm also not fastening the line down before I insert the line into here. That gives me a bit of wiggle room so that as I'm tightening that, it gives me just a little bit more space, a little more room to move. Okay. Gonna have to turn it the right way, Eric. Works a lot better when I turn it the right way. There we have it, second brake line installed. Now all I gotta do is bleed those brakes out. Here, you can see why, a little bit better, why we're replacing these lines. You can see that crack right there that opens up. Now that's just the outer covering. That doesn't mean that's imminent danger, but that certainly means that there's a problem happening there. And I'm showing them to you here. Now this side doesn't have the same problem, but you can sort of see, well, it does have the same problem. You can see where the dry rot's starting to set in. And underneath that, you can see that copper braiding. So that also helps protect the line itself. But I can tell you right now that if I was going to a racetrack and I had brake hoses that look like this, they would tell me to replace the brake hoses. So I'm glad we did this. Now that we've replaced both brake lines, or I should say brake hoses, we want to come back to the master cylinder and see basically how much leaked out when we were doing what we were doing. And looks like very little. Looks like we did our job pretty well in this case. So I don't really think we need to top off too much because there's still plenty of it left here. But we are definitely going to keep an eye on this level as we bleed the brakes to make sure that it doesn't run dry, because if it does, well, it's certainly going to be an issue. And I've reinstalled this cover because there are times when you are pumping brakes or bleeding brakes and you push down on the brake pedal. If the cover's not on, it could spray out of the master cylinder, so you want to avoid that. So at the very least, just rest the cover back on top of the master. You may not necessarily have to clip it, but you might want to do that because in some cases it might come squirting out. And brake fluid is really not good for paint, so you want to try to keep it away from any of your paint. In fact, I should probably throw a fender cover over here just to be on the safe side. Now it's time to bleed the brakes, and on these older calipers, I'm a little bit concerned about these bleeder valves being able to function as intended. Now, if you have a complete fail with a bleeder valve, and say you break the top of it off or something, you can also bleed right where the brake line connects to the caliper, so you can jump over to that if you need to, if you, like I say, if you break off the top of the bleeder. But to avoid that, so you still have the ability to use the bleeder, this is what I'm going to suggest. Why don't you come in here for a minute? What I have is this, on this side is a 3/8, or a 3/8 wrench is what I have, and it's a little bit closer. The other side was 9mm, but the other side was also rounded off. And I did some testing over there, but you can see that I've got quite a bit of movement here. And if I try to knock this loose in this state for the first time, there's a good possibility with this 12-point box end wrench that I could round this off and possibly make it so I can't use the bleeder. So what I've got here is I've got a 6-point socket 3/8 on my 1/4-inch ratchet. And what I'll do with this is I will try to break it loose with this and the 6-point, which has, which is going to hold on to it much better and have less of a chance of it rounding off. So I'll first attempt to do that. All right, I believe that broke it loose. Yeah. So it's broken loose now. And we talked about gravity bleeding, which we already have fluid coming out, which is a good sign for us. But I can close this down like so. And I don't have to worry about breaking it loose with this loose wrench. I've first done it with this ratchet, and it's 6-point. So 6-point is really good in these situations, especially when things get old and rusty. And sometimes you may even want to have to hammer on this socket. Like you take the socket off and hammer it onto the fastener or whatever it is you're trying to break loose, and then put your ratchet on and then try to knock it loose from there. Just a little something to hopefully keep you out of trouble. Now let's actually get down to bleeding these brakes out. And I'm going to enlist the help of cameraman Brian. Should be fun. In the car, cameraman Brian. Are you ready, cameraman Brian?
I've never been more ready.
Okay. Well, Brian is going to help me with the 2-person bleeding method. It's nicer to do this with 2 people than it is with a single person. And I'm going to be giving him general commands on as far as pumping the brakes and getting everything ready for this bleeding procedure. So, ready, Brian?
Ready.
Okay, I'm still going to employ the use of my famous brake bleeding tool here. I like using this because I can actually see the air coming out of the system, but I've got my wrench in place. In fact, I'll move it over like this a little bit more. I've got my wrench in place, and what I'm going to have Brian do is I'm going to have him pump the brake pedal probably about 5 or 6 times to build up some pressure before I even crack the bleeder open. So, Brian, could you hit the brake pedal like 5 times for me? Okay, Brian, on that last one, I just want you to hold your foot on there and have the pressure on the pedal. You don't need to like He-Man the thing, you just need to hold pressure on it. And then when it reaches the floor, actually, I'd rather not go all the way to the floor. Just let the brake pedal go down, and then I'll close the bleeder valve off, and then I'll ask you to let your foot up, and the brake pedal should return, and we'll start the process over again. Are you ready? All right. I'll hold pressure on the brakes. Okay, and you can see the air coming out there, and it's not moving anymore, so I'm going to close the bleeder. Okay, pump it up 5 times. All right, hold it. Close it off again. All right, 5 times. Hold it. You saw my tool came apart there, but as long as fluid's coming out, air's not going in, and that's what we care about. So I think you could see in this that there wasn't a lot of air in these lines. So we're going to move over to the other side and see what we get. You can let up on it, Brian. All right. Another tip. Brian has very wisely lowered the passenger side window a little bit. It's a lot easier to hear your buddy if the windows are open. So there's another little tip for you. Try to keep both windows open so you can keep the flow going. Now this side, as I said, I had some issues on this side, so this side has actually ended up being a 9mm, but the process is still going to be the same. I'm going to install my tool. And go ahead and pump it 5 times, Brian. All right, hold it. Open it up. Hopefully open it up. Yep, got some issues here. All right. Might have to resort to more drastic measures, unfortunately. Because yes, this is not happening. I'm only going here as a last resort. Because, well, it's a last resort, like I said. Okay, at least we can turn it now. Try and have our tool. Well, the tool doesn't necessarily want to go in, so I've got to go over and make sure I have my pan underneath so I don't have a bunch of fluid going all over the place. We'll try our best, but you know, it is what it is. Okay, Brian, you holding pressure? Hold pressure. Okay. Let that come out. Okay, pump it up. Hold it. All right, pump it. Hold it. On that one, my tool slipped off a little bit. How's that brake pedal feel? Is it? Awesome. Now, if this were power brake setup, in other words, if this had a vacuum booster on it, I would now want to start the car and see if the brake pedal still felt good. But since we don't have power brakes, that won't do anything at all to what we're doing here. So if it feels good now, we should be done. So let's wrap this video up. Okay, one more very important thing before we wrap up, and that is we want to make sure that our master cylinder is topped off. And as you can see, that fluid there on the large reservoir, which is the front brakes, is what went down. And I just thought of something while we're here. Why don't I just change out the brake fluid real quick? I'm just going to get a turkey baster and remove this brake fluid and just put new stuff in there. I realize that doesn't bleed the entire system, but it's better than nothing and gives me some fresh brake fluid to work with. So I'll be right back. It's a simple enough operation. I just have a regular turkey baster from the grocery store. You can see my brake fluid's kind of old. I'd like to say, especially since I'm going to be driving this car fast, but I mean, let's face it, this car is not fast. But this helps extend the life of your braking system. And it's not going to be all the brake fluid, but it'll be enough. It won't hurt it anyway. Alright, now we'll top it off with some fresh stuff. I suppose in some ways you could call that a brake fluid flush, albeit a poor one. Still, it's better than nothing. But as I said, with the age of the vehicle and the fact that this thing sits as much as it does, it's not a bad idea to get that old brake fluid out of there. As brake fluid gets old, its boiling point lowers, and as a result, in some cases, like say if you live in a mountainous area or something like that where you're having to use your brakes a great deal, that brake fluid could boil, and if it does, you would have brake fade, and that would be a bad thing. So the newer the brake fluid, the less apt it is to boil and cause problems with the system, so it's not a bad thing. But I'd like to extend a special thanks to cameraman Brian for helping out with the bleeding procedure today, but I think this about covers the brake hose replacement on the 1979 Ford Fairmont, soon to be going to a racetrack. Laughable, I know, but we're going to establish a baseline, and that was based on your suggestions, so well done, viewers, for coming up with such a great idea. Anyway, if you have automotive questions, I would ask that you head over to EricTheCarGuy.com. There's a welcome video there to tell you about all the wonderful features we have to help you with those automotive issues should you have them. In addition to that, you can find me on Google+, Facebook, and Twitter if you wish to connect with me socially. And I close each of my videos with be safe, have fun, and of course, stay dirty. I'll see you next time.